Joining me today is Steve Norton, who's the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Center for Public Policy Studies. So Steve, education. You mentioned the fundamental notion that there's been a decline in children. And I know from looking at demographic issues, after 2008, births in the United States declined in 2009 and 10, and maybe even to 11. I think they're rebounding a little bit. Mm-hmm. So there's going to be sort of a dearth that weaves through every school district. But beyond that, sort of as a blip, are we seeing macro trends in the decline in students?
So the decline in students began before the Great Recession in New Hampshire. Between 2005-06 school year and 2015-16 school year, we lost about 10% of the children, and that's not because they went into the woods. It was just there were no children coming behind.
And that's the in-migration. That's an in-migration, not birth.
That's correct.
Okay.
And so, communities across the state, on average, saw a 10% decline in the number of kids that could go to their schools, and that's going to fundamentally reshape where kids go to school and how expensive it is going to be to go to school. And ultimately, it will force, I think, the state to make some decisions about how and in what way it's going to change some of its funding of local education.
Well, and school, by and large, is a fixed cost-driven proposition. I mean, there's some variable costs, yep. But if I pay a teacher to teach a third grade class with 10 students, mm-hmm. I'm paying that teacher, whether there's 10, 15, or 20 in that class,
that's right.
In all likelihood,
yep.
The same amount.
That's right. And we see that in the data. During this period where we saw a 10% decline in enrollment, we saw a 30% increase in costs.
So the average cost per pupil is skyrocketing.
That's correct. Yep.
What's driving that cost?
So you can imagine with a system that has a lot of fixed costs, teachers and the like, you have to increase their expenditures. Sometimes transportation costs go up because people are beginning to move around in districts, move from one district to another district. We haven't got to the point yet where we are structurally downsizing. In some communities, we're starting to see that, where they're lowering the fixed costs because they can't afford or they don't believe that they want to go through that school in the same way that they've done in the past. So that's really the explanation.
And I guess we're also seeing, and I don't know if this is sort of just an anomaly, but in the news there have been small towns moving from one school district to their high school to another school district. Is that part of this shakeup potentially?
I think it is. I think it's a sign of stress in the system. Schools, traditionally, when population declines occurred in other parts of the country, schools consolidated. But in some instances, you can imagine that communities will start to peel away from a very expensive school to a less expensive school, perhaps. I think we're just seeing the leading edge of that, and I think it's likely to occur more in rural areas than in the more urban areas of the state over the next 5-10 years. Are there lessons to be learned from this happening elsewhere in the United States that New Hampshire can look at? It's a very difficult, trying process for communities to go through. As you can imagine, schools are part of the community resiliency that exists, and so these processes tend to be long and drawn out, and there's no easy solution, unfortunately. Does your data, and the data you've looked at, does it point to the health of the school, to the long-term health of the community, or can those things be separated? There's a literature out there that talks about schools as a central part of every community. It's particularly in rural communities where some of the institutions may have gone, businesses have separated or gone to some other parts of the state. So there is a literature out there that really points to schools being a cultural pillar of the community. And some of the arguments I've heard that you need to support the schools because the schools indirectly will support the property tax. Mm-hmm. Do you have any evidence of that? Well, you can imagine that a community that isn't vibrant, doesn't have income and wealth and growth in the number of families or income or housing, they're going to have an increasing burden on their property tax or their dollars. So generally speaking, it's easier to finance schools in communities where you're seeing growth and either business development or growth in wealth. So, well, we're out of time in this segment. When we return, we're going to cover another issue that's facing New Hampshire, and that's health care. So please stay with us.